Hey everybody, Robert Douglas here. It's Friday, it's December, and it's Friday the 3rd. And in fact, this is the final Deploy Friday episode for the year 2021. And our topic today is why is TypeScript taking over the world? And with me to discuss that extremely interesting topic are Apurv Khare and Alex Santos. Hey guys, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Apurv, do you want to go first? Who are
Sure,
you? Where are you? And what do you do?
sure. So I'm Apurv. I come from Bangalore, India, and I'm a web developer with 5 years of experience. I work on front end and I also work on back end, but both my stack involves JavaScript, so front end with React and back end with Node. Currently, I work with Walmart as a software engineer.
Walmart. So very high level brand name. What kind of things do you build with Walmart?
So we typically I'm in the team which we deals with B2B. So we help the vendors ship their stuff and do their fulfillment and help their inventory and all those stuff.
Awesome. Thanks. And thank you for being on the show.
Welcome.
Alex, how about you? Who are you? Where are you? And what's your job?
Yeah, so I'm Alex, 27 years old guy from Portugal, based in Ericeira. Yeah, and I work as a lead engineer at KI Challengers, which is part of a Khare group, and we call ourselves a venture building company. So we tend to form companies from day zero, then to prove the market, prove the product, investigate the idea, and then I'd say we only leave and normally stay with a connection when we got a proven problem and a product that solves it and a team that can push that forward. So of course I'm part of this process with my engineering knowledge to try to make this product, these teams a reality.
That
So
sounds super fun. And so that must mean you build a diverse number of things with TypeScript.
yeah, I did. So especially in on the current job, um, we've built a B2B platform for the chemical market. We've built a cloud platform for one of the big car OEMs, and we're currently building another still in-house B2B platform. So those are three things. There was one more, which was a B2C marketplace for Saudi Arabia. So yeah, but I tend to build a lot of things with TypeScript, being it on the backend or the front end.
All right. Well, let's get into a little bit about why you actually chose to use TypeScript, because the thesis here is that JavaScript, obviously being a very popular front end and back end programming language, has captured the hearts and minds of millions of developers all around the world. But TypeScript is actually catching up and converting JavaScript developers to TypeScript developers. And before we get into the details about why, I would like to hear what your journey was. How did that happen for you? Did it happen like that? Were you first a JavaScript developer and then you decided or were forced to get into TypeScript? What was that like?
To me, I didn't get it. Who was the question
Yeah,
for?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Alex, go ahead. Well, I'll ask Apurv as well, but you can start.
Okay, so I can actually say I got into TypeScript a little late. So TypeScript is from 2012, I guess, and I got into it like 4 to 5 years ago. Yeah, and it was so I always loved TypeScript, JavaScript, even though we all know it has quirks, right? Sometimes you can very easily shoot yourself on a foot, and after some years, I think you, and especially when you're scaling products or trying to maintain products over a long period of time, you feel the need for more safety. So more safety than actually the tests had already, but a type system. And yeah, TypeScript was filling that gap, even though, and I know like many other solutions appear, but I think TypeScript hit the sweet spot in adding types or adding all its features, but mostly types without that much hassle. So then we were in a project, we were trying to do proper refactoring to iterate fast. and the project was already a little big, and it pays off to have proper types and a more strict compiler that really helps you when it comes to refactoring functions, to knowing what it is, and even like onboarding people. So that was the decision. Yeah, we had a giant dashboard written on JavaScript, and we started to migrate to the first project was that started to migrate into TypeScript, because it actually allowed us to do this like bit by bit instead of stopping and doing a full migration, which wasn't even a possibility. So that's how I get there. And then from there on, I always start with TypeScript whenever, even if I'm building a pet project, even if I'm writing JavaScript, I know having the compiler when I want to make that code a little more robust, TypeScript is there and like offers the full set of features that we know.
Let's get the same. Thank you. Let's get the same first person testimonial from Apurv now. Were you also a JavaScript developer who then added TypeScript to your repertoire, and when did you do that and why?
So yeah, I was a JavaScript developer, and I heard about TypeScript around like 3.5 to 4 years ago. But at my first impression was like, no way I'm going to learn this, because it's typed, and I like the dynamic nature of JavaScript. And but 2 years ago, I had to work on a project which was in TypeScript. So I was like, oh my god, finally I might have to learn it. And it was a struggle. Initially, it was a struggle to learn, and I learned. But after a month of learning that, I was like in awe of TypeScript. I was like, oh my God, it is saving me so much time now. It takes its initial learning curve, but afterwards, once you start developing application, some errors that you find on runtime, like while testing the application, you can avoid all those errors during the development itself, during the compile time itself. And so I was like, awesome, like why did I just learn it earlier? And now I can't even imagine going back to any project which doesn't have TypeScript. And if it's under my control, if I have to choose, I would definitely go with TypeScript, because it's super like uh, half of your work is done. Like if you use TypeScript, half of your errors are gone. So yeah, that's how my perspective was. Like earlier, like totally not going to even start learning, and now I can't even leave. Like I have to do TypeScript if it's a JavaScript project.
So, what was the hard part of the learning curve for you, Apurv? You mentioned that it was difficult at first. What did you find difficult?
So usually, how JavaScript is written, like you can use a lot of things dynamically, so you don't have to statically type anything. But with TypeScript, what happens is there are different ways to even do the typing thing. So even we can use interface, you can use type, then there are generics, then there's record, then there's lot of things to be learned. Okay, and initially when you start developing with TypeScript, you will be thinking like, okay, I have to define types for this. I have to define types for this. I have to find a library which is a typed, so that it is compatible with this. So initially you will be like, okay, I have to do too much work in order to deliver some stuff compared to what JavaScript was there. So that was some like development time used to get increased, and that used to cause me like, okay, this is way too much work. But once you are used to how you define the types and how you go around that, so then it's easy. Like then it's just it's very it's in a flow state that you it's fine. Like it was just like JavaScript. How I used to write JavaScript. Now I write TypeScript.
You mentioned something interesting about libraries that are not in TypeScript and whether you're able to use those or not. I want to come back to that, so I'm going to just mention it and make a note right now. Libraries. And I have it on my notes over here, so I won't forget. But before we do that, Alex, what was your learning curve like? Was it hard for you as well? Or was it did it take about a month? I mean, that seems like a really fast transition to me.
Yeah. It was fast, but I think like I felt like I spent the whole day while I was working on a TypeScript project, the whole day in the TypeScript documentation. It was like I was always searching for syntax. I was always searching for, and yeah. So even though the documentation is great, because I really think it is, and it's been improving a lot. At the beginning, I think it's too easy to get into to doing way too many types. I would say I started trying to type like from the first moment, trying to type everything to a crazy amount. And then I was having loads of troubles doing this. And nowadays I like define the basic types and I start writing some code and I try to refine it and do it this way. It really helped. At the beginning, I was like, no, I have to know it all. And then like to me, it was an enlightening moment, the moment I found like utility types, because it's the record that or the partial or the required that Apurv talked about. I ended up like, but I want to write this, but I need more features. Does this mean I'll have to write these generics? So this, I spent some time on this trying to understand. And of course, that time I felt like it was a burden, like, what is this? But then nowadays it just feels natural, and I can't even consider going back. Of course, I'll work on JavaScript, but I'll prefer TypeScript. So yeah, there was a learning curve, but I think it's really fast. As you mentioned, it's really fast for such a thing or for such set of advantages.
So let's talk a little bit about what TypeScript actually is, in case there's anybody out there who is still not clear what the heck we're talking about. Now, I'm going to give you my understanding, and then you can enhance or correct that as you see fit. My understanding is that TypeScript is a semantic wrapper around JavaScript that imposes a type system on the variables and the classes and the functions. And that the compiler then compiles that code to actual JavaScript. And the output is nothing other than provably correct JavaScript where type checking has been done. And as a result of that, basically all of your JavaScript files are by default also TypeScript files. It's just that when you change them to TypeScript, you see a lot of warnings or errors. Can you actually just take any plain old JavaScript file and compile it into TypeScript, or will it prevent you from doing that until you take subsequent steps?
It depends on the compiler rules you have, but like by default, I don't say by default, but TypeScript with the correct configuration, TypeScript supports it. The thing is that you normally want to say like you don't want any's, or you don't want untyped properties or accessing properties of an object which you don't know the schema. And TypeScript tries to prevent you to do that. But yeah, you can take a JavaScript file, run it in TypeScript. You might have to turn off those warnings, but still it will interpret and it will run just fine because it's a superset of the language, as you said.
Okay. And is that then maybe the way that you do a migration project? If you've got a JavaScript project that you already have and you want to put it in TypeScript, you just change the compiler settings, compile it into JavaScript, and it's essentially the same code as before, but with different formatting.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I did
So usually,
this, it was this way. Yeah, please, Apurv.
yeah. So usually you have a TS config. So when we are doing migration, so I have done migration. So when we usually do migration, you start with simpler rules. So you disable all the tough stuff. You implicit any on all those stuff. You don't enable those, and you gradually start migrating your code. And eventually, iteratively, you try to make it more strict. So the good thing about the TypeScript is you can control the behavior of the compiler. You can tell it how strict you need to be. So if you're just migrating, if you're just coming new to TypeScript, then you can take it easy and try to learn better and then make it more strict. So that's a very good thing about TypeScript. So it especially helps during the migration part. So I did this migration because of this TS config, it was a bit easy. So you need to just have configure Babel loader, and you need to configure some ESLint rules. And the TS config is the main thing, which actually enforces the compiler to check for some things. So yeah.
So I would imagine the process then would be I crank down the compiler rules, then I go and I think, okay, what's the most important class in my code? Let's define that. And I go and put a TypeScript class definition in front of that. And then all of a sudden, a lot of actual unavoidable compiler errors would show up where that class is then being passed around but not defined by its type. Is that right?
If the other files are TypeScript, yes, but you can define a class in TypeScript and then from there use it in JavaScript files.
Okay. So you can progressively then work through your class definitions, and maybe if you want to have some fun, turn your compiler settings up a little bit and start knocking away the errors, and then turn it back off. And then do that every day for 10 minutes. And then eventually you've gone through your code base and you've TypeScriptified it.
Yeah, we actually did it like we started very similar to what you said. You started with the main entity, so defining types or interfaces for the main entities of the application, and then anyone who was using it was at first getting the autocompletes, which are already really good, because even if you don't have your in JavaScript files, if you're using VS Code, it understands that file is TypeScript and gives you crazy autocompletes, which already improves a lot. And then like if your base types are already TypeScript, you can import it just fine. It's a small step depending on how deep is your logic, but it's a small step to start working on the file you're on and tweaking it so that it's a valid TypeScript and actually typed with no warnings. So this being able to do it incrementally to me was a big selling point. Otherwise, it would be really hard to adopt it.
Apurv, you're shaking your head a lot, or nodding your head rather,
Yeah.
in agreement.
Yeah, in agreement. So if you can even choose which files you want to compile to via the TypeScript compiler and which you want to ignore. So even we have that level of control with the TS config. So that's something that I seriously love about that compiler. That you can choose to control how much do you want to go through the TS TypeScript compiler, how much you want to keep in JavaScript. So it's truly amazing. And also
So
about the TypeScript that VS Code thing. So we use the auto completion, right? So there's a theory that the Microsoft launched TypeScript in 2012, right? And afterwards it launched VS Code. So the main purpose of launching VS Code was that people would gradually adapt to TypeScript because VS Code itself inherently supports the TypeScript, and it makes your experience of developing any application TypeScript super. So it's that's another thing.
So it's not TypeScript taking over the world, it's Microsoft taking over the world.
Could be.
Again, and again, and again, and again. Right. Okay, so let's get to the my notes. I'm going to check my notes. Oh, look, I wrote libraries in my notes. Let's talk about those libraries. So if I'm a beginning TypeScript developer, I might think that all of a sudden all those JavaScript libraries that I love, and who would argue with me that using npm to download the entire internet is like practically a sport, right? Like npm just downloads lots of stuff almost all the time, and I'd think, do I have to go through all of those and convert all of those to okay. Do I have to convert all of those to TypeScript? What's the story then about libraries?
Yeah, so as I said, I got TypeScript a little late, so it was already a few years old. So many libraries, or the most used libraries, there was already a @types package, which is @types namespace on npm, which is maintained by Microsoft. This is an open source project, which for the libraries that don't include that do not include types, it adds types for those libraries. Of course, then gradually, as libraries start to implement the types and ship it inside its library's code, this @types, for instance, moment or for underscore, you don't need it anymore because the library itself has already. But yeah, I found quite some issues with less used libraries that have got through an update and the types package wasn't. But at that time, people were already confident enough, and you can actually create those types and either overriding them or contributing back to the project. But it was already fine because people had the knowledge enough to add types to those missing libraries because they weren't too big. Because the big ones, most of them had types already.
So it sounds like it's a potential problem, but it's actually not a problem just simply because the TypeScript community is active enough.
Yeah, so there is a definitely typed community which provides the types. So they are actively working on converting all of the JavaScript, not converting, but providing type definition for all the JavaScript projects. So someone can just Google definitely type, and there is a GitHub repo also, and there's a website. It's their job. Like they have taken the job of converting and adding types to JavaScript packages.
Provide me the link, and I'll bring it up on the screen.
Sure. I'll do that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So that's sounding not quite as scary. Can you put a quantification on the benefits? And I mean, you both expressed a lot of enthusiasm, but if I were the manager and I was saying, like, it sounds dangerous to force my team to learn a new language. Are you sure this isn't going to derail the project? What kind of statistics or anecdotal evidence would you throw at me to convince me to put this change through if I'm the skeptical manager blocking adoption of TypeScript?
I actually wrote a couple of decision logs on that because I went through a few migrations. So most of the arguments were towards, like, I would say, three things. So first was documentation, and I know it's arguable that types have documentation, but JavaScript project can get really messy, and these types really help. Having forcing people to think of interfaces and types at first, normally, I'd say, also increases the way the code improves the way the code is structured. So there was one. Then I think the cost for the project itself wasn't too big because, again, it could be incremental, and that had a lot of benefits. And yeah, I would focus on those three things. I know there's these statistics that say, oh, X% of bugs get reduced, but it's hard for me to bring such a fact because it should really depend on the project and actually on the team. You can write very clear and clean JavaScript code without TypeScript and with proper documentation, but I think TypeScript just makes it a lot easier. The warnings actually help you a lot. The documentation and the access you have, for instance, with TypeScript, to go to the docs and see the docs properly because you have them all defined. All of that, I think, adds a lot of value. But yeah, so if you were that manager blocking, this would be my three main reasons. And actually, we actually felt it improved. So we had some tests that were replaced by JavaScript. Not all of them, of course, but you end up doing lots of tests, like assert if that this works, if parameter X or Y is being sent. And with TypeScript, those tests you can remove because it does it by itself. Then of course you have to add the rest of the tests. But I would say those are the things, like docs, not much cost to add to a project, and these assertions on the go. And the fourth would be auto completion, because it's crazy good.
Yeah, I'm not quite convinced. I think I need to hear Apurv's arguments as well.
Yeah, so it's actually tough to convince your manager because it is actually work, because it will add to your development time. But I had this anecdote. So what happened is, I gave this example to my manager that earlier we were doing some bug fix, and it was a very urgent bug fix. So we did that bug fix, and we did the testing on the local. It was in stage, and in stage it just crashed, and we were like, okay, debugging, what's the issue, and the issue was simple. So we were using array method splice, and but the thing which was expected to be array didn't turn out to be an array. It turned out to be null or undefined. So this sort of things will be prevented during the compile time itself if you are using TypeScript. So it will say that this could be possibly null or undefined. Okay, so you can either use optional chaining, or you can use you can do other prevention sort of stuff, but then it will not basically break. So that time entirely of going to stage and then again fixing that bug, again putting it to stage, so that time would have been saved. So that was the anecdote that I used, and then obviously, and then we started migrating it to TypeScript.
So if I were to summarize that, it would be something like, do you want to find your bugs after you deploy them or before you deploy them?
Before.
Yeah, or after you test them manually, because you're writing, the compiler gives you an error, it's pretty much instant. If you're working on a page or on an endpoint, you have to go use Postman or run the tests to see that it's failing. So those 10 seconds or 15 seconds that you get with the compiler before testing it by hand, and hopefully you get the error, I think it pays off after very, very short time.
Or maybe another way to phrase it would be, TypeScript can help you find errors that you wouldn't even think to test for.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
By default.
Well, okay, guys, you finally convinced me.
All right. Let's work on the project then.
Yeah, let's do it. But first, I have some other questions. For example, TypeScript is not the first statically typed language that could compile to JavaScript. There was CoffeeScript, GWT, Dart, but we're not doing a broadcast about those. Those don't seem nearly as interesting these days, just in terms of adoption and prominence. Why? What happened?
So basically, CoffeeScript and GWT, which is Google Web Toolkit, and that what they tried is they tried to treat JavaScript as an intermediate language. So they created their own syntax and completely different from JavaScript. Tried to bring in object-oriented programming and all those stuff, and they treated JavaScript as an intermediate language. So all the JavaScript developers had to now completely learn a different languages. So that's one barrier that it had. What TypeScript did different is that it is a superset of JavaScript. They're just adding types to it. You just write your normal JavaScript. There is no syntax change. That you don't have to learn anything else, and you just have to learn your simple JavaScript and just add types to it. So that's the major difference why TypeScript got adopted so well and others did not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
I'll have to agree. Even though I have used a little CoffeeScript, but haven't used the GWT or Dart. But I will even bring Flow, which isn't a isn't a new language, but it was at the time it was this compiler by Facebook, which allowed you to add types. And yes, I completely agree with Apurv. I think they hit, as I said, the sweet spot between the compromise and the trade-offs. And I really buy into the argument of not having to learn a new language, because it's the same language. You learn here, you end up spending most of the time writing actually JavaScript, because at the end it's very similar, just add a lot of stuff. Then you move to another project or to your front end, which is not TypeScript yet, and you can still use many of the things, many of the code, hold that knowledge. And learning a new language just to do a specific thing, to me, that language just has to add a lot of value for me to consider that, because I'm already fluent on JavaScript. So I completely buy into Apurv's arguments.
So is there any reason why TypeScript and JavaScript should actually remain separate over the long term? Is it your opinion that TypeScript should just replace JavaScript or be adopted by the next ECMAScript standard? And is there an actual movement to do that I don't know about yet?
Not that I know, and like that's controversial. At least I think that's interesting. I've had many conversations with people that say, "Oh, you're breaking my loved language, which is JavaScript. Now I have to go into a project and write TypeScript, and I don't want to. I like this flexibility and so on." So I still think there's a cool percentage of people that they just want to write JavaScript, or they haven't faced many of the challenges that on their project. They face others, not the ones that the TypeScript aims to solve, or they happen to be in a really strict team, which their JavaScript is crazy good and really clear, and they go around many of those bugs or those problems that might come out of not having TypeScript. But I wouldn't say, like, that'll be interesting. I wouldn't say we're that close yet, but with the amount of people that are getting interested, who knows?
I imagine a world where it's polarized between the typers who don't want to get bugs and the anti-typers, and the two are at conflict with each other in JavaScript society. Is it like that?
Could be.
I wouldn't say so. At the end, it's like we all love JavaScript and we all love to write these applications and the productivity that comes out of JavaScript. But
so
yeah,
if you're in a bar together, it's not like you're at different ends of the bar peering at each other very suspiciously.
No, it's just that you don't look at them straight. You just turn their back.
Oh, right.
Other than that, it's fine.
You never know how they're going to react because it's untyped.
Yeah, that's true. What if someone sends a string in?
How much code does TypeScript add to the code base? How much longer? Like when I'm at home, I live in Germany and I speak English and German, and sometimes you have books on the shelf that are in both English and where you have the same book in English and German. And sometimes I even like have a book in French. Don't ask me why, because I don't speak French. But like the English book is like this thin, and the German book is like this, and the French book is like this. Same book, same story. What's
A
it like
lot
for
of
TypeScript?
words.
I would say it would add around 30 to 40%, depends on how typed you make it. Like it
How
also
much?
depends on how typed you make it. 30 to 40%. Again, it depends on how much type you add to it, how much strict you are going to be with. But yeah, 30 to 40% is what I'll say. And regarding
Yeah.
your talk about question about TypeScript taking over JavaScript, so it's still, I think it's going to be dependent upon the developer, but they are actually now making frameworks which are TypeScript first. So recently, Remix was released. So it's a meta framework based on React. So they have, by default, they obviously gives you option to use JavaScript, but their documentation and all their tutorials are based on TypeScript, because they now understand that most of the developers are moving to TypeScript. So it will be like TypeScript first, but definitely JavaScript is an option that you can use.
Yeah, and for libraries, I think it's another. Not forgetting about your question, Robert. Sorry. It's like you write your library on TypeScript, and even JavaScript developers using that library will have much better autocompletion. Once again, even if you don't have it on the project, VS Code will give you pretty much the same autocompletion because that library has proper strict types. So
So the JavaScript developers get to benefit from the TypeScript work for free, even if they don't choose to adopt TypeScript. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and regarding that, yeah, I agree with Apurv, but 20 to 30%, like maybe a little bit more. Also depends on how much entities you have, how much interfaces or types you have. Because if you end up using many of the libraries types, or if your project is around the like 10 types that you defined, then you end up reusing loads of things. And the most you know about the utility functions, the more types you use. You have like union types, exclusion types, etc. That really reduces. But yeah, I'd agree it has a lot. I wouldn't say it's French, but it could be German.
Okay.
I'd agree.
I wonder what the longest, most verbose language on Earth is. Like, if you translated a book to every single language on Earth, which one would be the longest? I know that Japanese, for example, is really concise, and like the same book in Japanese is like paper thin. So, do you guys have any knowledge about that? I guess it's
I
not
have no
really.
I mean, if
idea.
you could convert it to binary, then it will be like the largest, I think.
That's
Ones and
true.
zeros.
That is actually true. The best answer. You got the best answer. You win.
That is true.
I am going to make it a life goal to have something like Moby Dick or Charles
Written in
Dickens'
binary.
Tale of Two Cities
Already.
in binary, printed out in paper on my shelf. It'll be like a whole shelf. my guests will come and ask, "What's that?" And I was like, "Here, she'll want to read a story. Let's read."
Yeah, I'll teach you. You just have to know 2 characters. Then it's your work.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a question about the refactoring. It seems to me, just thinking about like what I know of IDEs, that if I were trying to convert a JavaScript file into TypeScript, if I were to like give a variable a type, does it then like ask me, do I want to update all of the functions that use that variable to also accept that type right off? Can you like just go through the whole known code base and do a refactor like at a click of a button?
I would say
I
so.
don't
Yeah, please.
think so. Yeah. Uh, I don't think so that level of refactor is available currently. But yeah, soon could be. What's your take on
Yeah,
it?
Well, Eclipse does that with Java for like
yeah.
20 years.
I think it depends on how standard is your project and how TypeScript compiler actually understands your project. Because sometimes you have like we had a project which was Webpack, and the TypeScript compiler was interpreting TypeScript files, and Babel was interpreting JavaScript files. And there, the vision that TypeScript had on the project was a little narrow because he was looking at those files, interpreting the others, but still there's all these compiling tools that enable you to add the syntax sugar, features that are not on the language yet, and so on. So those things can actually confuse the compiler a little. But that level of refactoring, I wouldn't compare it to Java just yet. But I feel like if you have a set of utility function or a class that is being used on raw TypeScript files, if you change the type of the variable, then it will be changed across the code, and the places it can change, you'll have a compiler error because you change the number to a string, and now there's a function which is requiring a number, and you're sending a string. So at least that you get. I think these refactoring capabilities are really increasing, and it's happening more and more. For instance, renaming symbols, renaming variables, changing the types. It's getting much better now than it was when I started. So I guess that's where we're going.
Sounds great. What do the trends show? I know that organizations like Stack Overflow, JetBrains, Hacker Earth often take polls and surveys about the state of web development languages and tooling and measure the trends there. If I were to look there and compare, what would I see right now?
You would see that TypeScript is ranking up in the most loved language. So it's like third on Stack Overflow survey, and also in some other surveys, it's like more likely to learn this year. So there's an option which language do you want to learn this year. So it's TypeScript is in the top, like it's I think first. So that's what the trend is going towards.
So the TypeScript futures market is exploding.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a little confusing though. Like if I write my project in TypeScript, does it count twice? Like, do I get to count as a JavaScript developer as well? Like,
yeah, I think you are still JavaScript developer.
I mean, they might be double spending their counting there, right? Like, I say I'm doing a TypeScript project, but it's actually also a JavaScript project. I'd have to look at their accounting.
I think they should.
Oh, but that would mean that the numbers should be the other way around, right? Because it's like
JavaScript would always be the bigger number in that case.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that's not the case. So TypeScript is larger number of developers than JavaScript?
I think it's the most loved language. It's not the mostly used is for sure JavaScript. So that's for sure JavaScript. Especially because like you end up in projects where it's just a compiled version of a TypeScript project, which ends up being JavaScript. But the most loved is like I used it and I actually loved it. And I would use it again. I think this is one of the best success metrics. I think it was the one Apurv mentioned. So
the hearts and mind metric.
Yeah.
Okay. That would indicate that the strictness is not a burden, because I think that Apurv, you mentioned at the very beginning a kind of a mentality of I like my freedom, don't take my freedom away from me. Over, you'll have to pry those types into my cold dead fingers type of sentiment. But actually, people like the strictness.
I think like the fact that you can choose the amount of strictness, for instance, there's projects where any, which is like the generic type for like you don't want to set the type, you set any, or you can set unknown if you want to be a little more strict or communicate to everyone that you don't know what this type is about. But there's projects where any is completely like prohibited or not allowed by linter or compiler rules. There's projects where it is. So these settings that Apurv mentioned actually let you choose how much TypeScript do you want. And when I say TypeScript, is how much of the strictness you want. And as you said, you can start with very low strictness and then increasing it as you move past the files and as you increase your code's reliability. So I would say there's projects that spend their full life with a low strictness of TypeScript, and that's actually solving many problems while not having all of the burden. If you want to be really strict, then you have to have a team that knows a lot of TypeScript or has used it and is okay into typing it. So it's very okay on not having those types of fields that safety. So I think even that they did it correctly, which is it's not a one size fits all. You can still tweak it to fit your to fit your project or what you're currently doing or your phase of the project, which I think is even more interesting.
And from what I know of typing and object-oriented languages in general, is it possible with TypeScript, do you think, if you don't think through what you're doing carefully, to actually make your project worse because of the way you define your types or the way you use your interfaces? Is this a situation where it's just, for some people, just enough intellectual rope to hang themselves?
Yeah. So if you don't know what you're actually working on, like if you're beginner to it, or you're just assigned a TypeScript project which was already there, so yeah, it could be a burden like that, and you could screw it up. But eventually, there will be a learning curve, and once you understood, because you can't know all of the TypeScript. So some things you will be there that okay, you might need to go to documentation and try to understand what is this, why is it like this, and then come back to it. So yeah, and initially I have gone through this. I did was like, okay, I'm never going to able to deliver this feature because I cannot figure the TypeScript stuff. But eventually you just dig it and you try to fix it.
I would agree, especially like what comes to my mind when you say that it's generics. You can create your own generics, and there is, as it happens everywhere, there's over engineering with generics.
What are those?
It's like functions that like type functions that receive other types. So, for instance, you're generating an object. So there's a utility function or a generic in TypeScript, which is the record, in which you say this record is an object, and you send two types in. The first of one is the type of the key, and the second one is the type of the value. So that's one of the standard that comes in the language. The thing is that you can create those yourself. So if you're creating a type generic for the podcast participant, it would be, for instance, name, stack, and experience. And then you can create DeployFriday participant. And by that you can generate types for a lot of participants and keep adding characteristics. But the thing is, you can, if you create your own generics, a lot of them, because it's useful, and then you have your full project full of those, I can see that might frustrate lots of people, because then you have to learn the project syntax or the project types, the project generic types, more than the ones that the language provides. So that can get overcomplicated.
And that's, let me see if I understand that. So you've just made it worse than JavaScript because you're trying to like be as flexible as JavaScript.
Yeah.
Your JavaScript mind might want you to be. So you're like bending out the parameters of TypeScript, but then you still have to go back and like type everything in the right way so that it can be used, and that then represents just an internal project logic that you've put in there.
Yeah, you created way too many types, or you created the types like with loads of optional properties that weren't optional, but it was cool because you were, for instance, creating an object on 3 stages, and it would be cool for you if that object could exist without the 2 required properties, and you just go there, you tweak the type, so that TypeScript will not prevent you. It's like it still requires people to think of it through. But you can get you can shoot yourself on the foot for sure if you try to, I would say, add too many types or typify too much, over engineering the types.
Are there design pattern libraries in the TypeScript world that people draw from to avoid that? Is there a lot of good thinking and learning going on? Is there a gang of 5 for TypeScript?
Not that I know. So
yeah,
I think
there are a couple of books. Yeah, opportunity. Yeah, there's a couple of books that I think there on design patterns of TypeScript, but it's not as widely known as it's for JavaScript. So it's gradually happening, and as you said, opportunity. So yeah.
Cool. So I learned in speaking to you both prior to this episode that there is a new runtime, which is now a competitor to the Node.js runtime called Dino. What's that?
Yeah, so Dino is actually a exchange of the syllables inside the word node. So it's like they're the other way around.
Oh my
That's why
gosh,
it's
I didn't
Dino.
even see that.
Yeah, yeah. This was the rationale behind it. So it's a JavaScript runtime that still runs on top of V8, and it was created by the creator of Dino of Node, Ryan Dahl, and there's actually a company behind it now, and yeah, they have 3 or 4 pillars. So the short story is that Ryan created Node, and then sometime along the way he got out of the core team, and then when he got back using Node, he was missing like the language had evolved, the runtime had evolved, and he was missing that productivity. So he was feeling like there was way too many things, lots of problems with Node modules, lots of specific syntax that only exists in Node, which is supposed to be JavaScript, but then doesn't exist on the browser. Then it was missing a security model that would let you isolate your code running in Node from the underlying system. So there's nothing preventing you when you install an npm package that the pre-install script is actually going through your file system and reading things or writing things or whatever. So all of this Ryan was missing, especially because he had been doing a lot of Golang. And so this made him create Dino, and he actually started the core written on Golang, but nowadays it's Rust. So when they're doing a whole lot of things, so they're making it strictly compatible with browser JavaScript. So all the functions that run on the browser, they will run on Dino. Things like fetch that in Node you can't have it. You need a polyfill. Um, so they have the security model. So for you to run the code, you have to give it permissions. For instance, to access file system or specific folders on the file system or specific environment variables, reading files, doing network calls. So all of this is specified and blocked by default, which is a really good upside. And then it gets you out of the centralized registry, which is npm, because it lets you run code or importing code based on a URL. So if you, Robert, have on your website your very magic JavaScript file, you can say
I do.
import whatever function from Robert Douglas dot, I don't know, your website / my magic JavaScript file, and Dino will install that, compile that, and as Apurv was saying, Dino is as TypeScript as a first-class citizen. So you just go there, you don't need to install anything. You do Dino run a TypeScript file, it compiles to JavaScript, and it runs. So basically, this is a short summary of it. So the version 1 got out last year's May. Nowadays, it's much more ahead, and there's actually a lot of companies already using it in production. But like the adoption is increasing. I find it a lot nice. I really love it.
I find it interesting that it compiles the TypeScript for you, which to me indicates another security level, because even if you're a TypeScript developer and you compile your TypeScript and you've got JavaScript files, who knows what happens on the way to the forum, right? Like a funny thing could happen to those files. Who knows? Are they provably exactly the files that you compiled? I mean, maybe they are, probably they are, but who knows? How do you know 100? How can you prove it? So if you actually like ship TypeScript files and the server compiles them in the very short time it takes to do that when it starts, then it would throw an error if they don't compile, and at least you know that the source compiles through TypeScript and you don't have those errors that you're meant to be catching anyway.
Yeah, and they do like you don't need to install modules with Dino. If you have a cached version, it will use it. It's checksum, so we have a log file. We still have a log file, but you don't need to. There's no node modules on Dino. It checks if you have.
Oh, it does content addressability for the modules. Yeah, I saw that, which saves. Yeah, it saves not only space but also memory, and it also saves the DLL hell situation where you've got like
Yeah.
conflicting modules. Is that the
Yeah.
thinking behind it? Conflicting
so
versions of the same module.
Exactly. So that's like in terms of space data, that's crazy, and actually that's a whole new problem that we were having on JavaScript, like conflicting versions being installed on the same place, and then how can you do? You end up going around trying to fix it, but yeah, Dino solves it all. It all in those things, of course.
And performance-wise, how does it compare to Node? I mean, Node became popular in part because it was so performant and could handle a lot of web native situations better than the models that came before it, FPM, PM, whatever models.
Actually, Dino, they're keeping it very in account, because they have a page which I'll share with you, which is dinoland.slash/benchmarks, in which they keep the benchmarks of every version of Dino. So you can see that they have like execution time, thread count, memory usage, type checking, IO, like latency, web server. So they compare it with many things. One of them is Node, the other is like raw Rust. So that you can have an idea. I have an idea that at the beginning, when I was looking at it, the latency wise, Dino was having a better average, but in throughput, Dino was Node was still better, especially on HTTP throughput. But they're keeping it in consideration. They're looking at it very often, and that's why they keep it here. So every time there's a minor version of Dino, these graphs are updated, because they're taking it in consideration. So if they want to actually compete somehow with Node, they have to have an answer for this.
But the numbers look very similar to me.
Yeah, they're getting very similar.
So it's not an overwhelming advantage. You don't go to Dino because of the performance. You go because of the other 4 pillars that you mentioned.
Yeah. And there's a cool thing, I wrote a couple of blog posts about it, is that in the future you can write Rust code and then import it from Dino, saying that that's a lib. In your code base, JavaScript code base, you write Rust, and then they provide you an interface from JavaScript to connect to that Rust code. So imagine you have a project that that function is getting really slow. You can rewrite it in Rust for real, and then have your JavaScript code calling that function and receiving the response back. For instance,
wow, we'd need an entire new episode just to discuss whether or not that's actually a good idea or a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm sure some Rust developers will be happy about that for sure. Yeah. So let's say that I just missed this entire episode and I just walked into the room. Like we can simulate that. Welcome. Oh, hi guys. I'm Robert. I'm a JavaScript developer. I don't think I'll ever use TypeScript. Change my mind. You've got 2 minutes. Apurv, you go first. From the beginning. I haven't heard anything we just said.
Okay, so you don't have to be worrying too much about it. TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript. You don't have to learn any other syntax as such. It's just you need to add types. You can add types to it incrementally. So let's say you're currently in your JavaScript project and you want to migrate it to TypeScript. You can gradually add types, make it as strict as you want, little, and then gradually make it better. And you can even exclude files that you currently don't want to have changed into TypeScript. And also, so because of this, you will save a lot of time which you find during the runtime. So basically, if you just coded your module and then now you're testing it in a browser, but now you run into some error because you just called a method on an array, but that error was not supposed to be there. It is null or undefined. This sort of things will be caught in your IDE only. There will be a red squiggly line, and you'll know that's the warning, and it could be a null or undefined. You can take care of that at that time itself. So you will be saving a lot of time in development. So yeah, that's my idea.
All right, great. Different simulation. Oh, hey, Alex. Hi, I'm Robert. I'm a Java developer, but I have to retool, and I'm thinking about learning JavaScript. Should I do that?
I think you should do that. I think you'd feel, and if you're a Java developer, you will not see any problem with TypeScript at the beginning. So you can add types from day zero as you do with Java, because that's what you are, right?
TypeScript. I just said JavaScript. Which one should I learn first?
So if you learn TypeScript, you'll end up learning a lot of JavaScript still, because TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that lets you add types and those guards that you're for sure used to from the Java world. So, and I would even say you will not get on the way. So you can write JavaScript, copy codes from Stack Overflow, and then from there, as you want to improve the reliability of your code, you can fill the safety, which is adding types. So it's not mandatory. It's your pace. You can write JavaScript, and then, okay, now I want to make it a little more reliable, and I'll add types. Or I want to document it a little better, I'll add types. But TypeScript will not get you in the way, will not oblige you to do anything. So if you're writing JavaScript, I would say there's nothing that should be preventing you from adding TypeScript, because there comes to a point on your cycle in which it will really, really help.
And where should I learn? How should I learn? Should I sign up for a Udemy course? Should I copy codes from Stack Overflow? What's the best way?
I'm a little biased because I really like the TypeScript documentation, and they have it. They actually have 5 types of tutorial. Yeah, it's 5, in which they say TypeScript for a new programmer, for JS programmers, for Java, C#, functional programming, or TypeScript in 5 minutes. And their
that contextual aware documentation. We were just talking about that last week.
Exactly. Exactly. So it makes a lot of sense in their handbook. If you go through their handbook, you'll have what it takes to start writing it. Then, as any other thing, you'll come back to the documentation. But going through the handbook, I think it gets you in a point where you can feel already productive.
Okay, so your answer is RTFM. Great, thank you very much. Apurv, how would you suggest?
Yeah. So the documentation is definitely the go-to place. But Microsoft in their portal have created an entire course for you to learn TypeScript, and it's completely free. So you can go ahead and take a look at it, and there are 6 modules in that, and that's perfect course for you to learn TypeScript. Yeah, and there's a handbook that you mentioned.
MSDN that you're referring to? Is that still a site? MSDN, is that where you go?
No. So it's docs.microsoft.com, and in that you have to choose for TypeScript. So that's where you should go for. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, that was a great episode. I learned a lot, and I'm actually in the background, I'm actually studying TypeScript myself. So it was really fun for me to do this episode with you, and I got some pointers and tips that will legitimately be helpful for my journey, and I hope other people did as well. Did you have anything else you want to add just before we close?
Yeah, so I would like to say that if you are a JavaScript developer and you should just try to explore TypeScript. Just go ahead and there's a TypeScript playground. If you just Google about it, TypeScript playground, and just try to play around it. Try to learn a bit. So you will save a lot of time. Trust me. And it's just awesome. Once you start writing your program in TypeScript, you will never be able to go back to JavaScript. You will be like, okay, I also only want to work with TypeScript.
Yeah, what can I have? I can say that if you're having troubles with or tips on JavaScript or TypeScript or Dino, feel free to hit me up. If I know, I'll answer and I'll help you. I think it can help on those first stages. I definitely had that help, and I think it helps everyone. So if you're following Apurv's advice, which you should, and you're having trouble, like, feel free to hit me up. And yeah,
awesome
to see numbers going up.
That's a great offer to the entire world. Wonderful. Well, thank you both for being my guests on Deploy Friday, on the last Deploy Friday of 2021. I hope that both of you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Don't forget to deploy your code. Friday is the best day for deploying code, especially if you use TypeScript and a platform as a service like Platform.sh, sponsors of this webcast. And also enjoy your weekend and the holiday seasons for whatever holidays you might have coming up in your home country and cultures. Enjoy them all, and hopefully we'll see each other again in January. Bye-bye.
See you soon. It was really nice.